Tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to A View from Afar. And today, in this the 10th episode of A View from Afar for 2023, political scientist Dr Paul Buchanan and I will examine the Israeli-Palestine atrocities. Now, this is a bit of a long interview, so I'm contextualising it to take the weight off Paul. So just bear with me and we'll cross to Paul at the end of this. The introduction is representatives of the Arab states presented a united front at the United Nations yesterday. They were criticising the United Nations Security Council for doing nothing to protect civilians from Israeli bombing, missile attacks on the Gazan civilian locations. Now, since then, the United States Security Council and the United Nations in general has considered two resolutions, the latter calling for a pause in hostilities to allow a humanitarian effort to enter Gaza to assist civilians. Now, the United States vetoed that Security Council resolution. Jazera, the news outlet, has detailed that Israel forces have targeted and bombed civilian facilities throughout the Gaza Strip, including hospitals, in plural, schools, residential areas, resulting in the deaths of thousands of people, civilians, and around 1/3 of those deaths being children. It remains contested by all sides in this conflict as to who or what is responsible for the deadly attacks on the Gaza hospital, resulting in the deaths of around 471 people. Additional to this, Israel has sealed the borders of Gaza. It has stopped any food, water, medical supplies from reaching civilians. Now, this blockade, Israel said, would remain in place until all hostages are returned to Israel. Now, over the last 24 hours, the United States President Joe Biden visited Israel. He indicated to Israel that it has the United States' full support while cautioning against the indiscriminate targeting of all Palestinians in Gaza. It appears Joe Biden, President of the United States, has also caused Israel to agree to let humanitarian aid to reach those trapped within Gaza, and they're talking about civilians in this context. It remains unknown as to how long this halt in any attacks would be, if indeed it does occur, or when it may take place and for how long. Earlier, Israel ordered Gazan civilians who wish to get to safety to move toward the south of the country, to the border with Egypt. But as people fled south to apparent safety, Israel bombed the South Gaza region, killing more civilians and sealing off that corridor for others seeking refuge. Now, as a consequence of that manoeuvre, Egypt sealed the Gaza-Egypt border and was concerned that should people come through and into the Sinai, that conflict would escalate from there. Humanitarian aid continues to sit on trucks waiting on the Egypt side of the United Nations officials have been imploring Israel and Egypt to allow medical supplies, food and water to get through to those who are injured and dying as priorities. Now, the Israel Defense Force strikes followed, of course, a surprise attack on Israeli citizens by soldiers under the Hamas banner. Now, here in New Zealand, where there is a sizable Palestinian advocacy groups and also diaspora, those advocacy groups like the Palestinian Solidarity Network, Aotearoa, have suggested that breaches of international humanitarian law, crimes against civilians, have been committed by those Hamas fighters, but they are clear, as others are too, that crimes against humanity, war crimes, have been committed by Israel as well in its response as disproportionate. It is brutal and disregarding of the thousands of Palestinian lives that have been taken that are among civilian casualties and deaths. Now, that is the situation in the region at the moment in Gaza and inside Israel. It could change dramatically, significantly, and without warning. So that is the context behind our episode at this particular time, and our questions will include: what are the world's leaders doing to stop the carnage? Are the world's nations being drawn into what will be an ever-expanding war? Are we witnessing the beginning of a war where, on one side, authoritarian-led states like Russia, Iran, the wider Arab states, and possibly even China stand unified against the United States, Britain, Germany, and other so-called liberal democracies and their allies that represent perhaps the old world order? Is this what we are witnessing? And is this what happens when a global rules-based order, multilateralism, and institutions like the United Nations no longer have influence to prevent war or restore peace and stability or assert principles of international justice and enforce the rights of victims to seek recourse via the law? Finally, the questions. Why has this slaughter become an opportunity for a polarized world, perhaps focused around the United States and Russia, to square off potentially in the near future against each other as the United Nations Security Council, within the United States Security Council, a body that was once designed to advocate and achieve peace, but has now become a geopolitically divided entity of stalemate and, some would say, mediocrity. Now, we will cross to Paul in a short moment, but before we do so, remember that you are welcome to make comments within the program here for those that have joined us live. We welcome those, but do be aware that your comments may be used and included in this program. So we'll cross to Paul. He is waiting to discuss this, and Paul, with that context all done, will be able to lead us through sets of issues that perhaps are getting left behind in other areas. Now, tēnā koe, Paul. Good to see you, Eho.
Kia ora, Selwyn. I'm sorry that we meet under these circumstances, but it's good to be back.
Good. Paul, I've said a lot with the introduction and the contextualizing, as the audience knows from the beginning of that, that's designed to lift a lot of the current affairs elements of what we are witnessing at the moment in Israel and Gaza out of the burden of your shoulders so that we can get down to the picture of how you're seeing it, and also what perhaps we can expect from various powers, whether they be regional powers, small powers, or the global powers that are very quickly becoming engaged or interested in this conflict. Over to you, Paul.
Okay, yeah, what I'd like to do is, in a dispassionate way, talk about the first order, second order, and third order issues involved in this conflict, which can metastasize into something much bigger. And we'll get to that in due course. Just a brief primer on how we came to be here. We have to remember that in order to stay in power, the Netanyahu government in Israel had to agree to a coalition with a group of right-wing nationalists, religious I would say, extremist parties. And the demands of these parties were to increase the settlements, particularly in the West Bank. These parties are basically fueled by immigration from the United States and Russia, and they're heavily Zionist. Okay, they want it, the entire area to be Israeli. So Netanyahu made a pact with the devil. And as they increased settlements in the West Bank, there was obviously resistance to that. And there's been a number of provocations where, for example, Israeli forces have gone into the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem and beaten worshipers in that house of worship. I mean, it's been rather ugly over there. But the important thing for our discussion today is that Netanyahu ordered that active duty troops on the border with Gaza, that is in South Israel, be redeployed to protect the illegal settlements in the West Bank. Active duty troops protecting these settlers from the local residents who would throw rocks at them and what have you. And before Hamas launched this attack, 264 Palestinians have been killed this year, not just by the army, but by settlers themselves. These settlements are, heavily armed. So a lot of bad blood in the run-up, but the key here is that Netanyahu withdrew troops from the border. What was left there were weekend warriors, so reservists. As it turns out, they rely very heavily. Those border fences that we saw being breached were manned electronically. They weren't running patrols up and down the bottom of the fence. They were relying very heavily on cameras and whatnot, and Hamas found out a way to disable the cameras using drones. And I'll get to that in a second. So that right there, the removal of troops from the border region to the West Bank, Netanyahu's decision, was an open invitation to Hamas to have a go, because they simply had a weaker line to hold or to attack, excuse me. The other thing, and it's been more speculative, but there are reports that Netanyahu ignored the intelligence warnings that he was receiving, that he simply did not believe or did not care about intelligence that suggested that Hamas was going to launch a large-scale attack in the upcoming weeks and months. We now know that the Egyptians warned Israel 2 weeks before the attack that Hamas was going to do this, and they were ignored. There's reason to believe that Mossad and other Israeli intelligence agencies were aware that something was going on. And yet, for whatever reason, Netanyahu decided to make light of it. And some people speculate that he was inviting a war because he felt that it would consolidate support for him within the Israeli polity because of all the demonstrations against his constitutional reforms, his attempt to diminish the power of the Israeli Supreme Court. It was, I hate to say it, but it was an authoritarian ploy to try to use an impending conflict to rally nationalist sentiment behind him in his time of trial. For their part, it's clear now that Hamas has been preparing its attack for at least 2 years, and it wasn't an intelligence failure per se. I've just talked about the warnings, but it was not as if Hamas was training in the Gaza Strip. Hamas was training in Syria and Iran, by all accounts. And the weapons they use, of course, are Russian, Iranian, and to some extent Chinese. But more importantly, the tactics that they used were tactics that, among other things, were developed in the Ukraine. Again, the use of drones, armed drones to attack the outposts. The fact that they did a joint arms assault, air, sea, and land. Now, admittedly, their Air Force were these paragliders with a gunner in the front and the pilot in the back, skimming low underneath any radar. No F-16 can take those things down. They're going too slow and too close to the ground. That was an interesting innovation. They launched seaborne attacks on rigid-ribbed inflatables, much like our lifeguards use out here and on Auckland's west coast, very similar to that. And they were mildly successful in storming the beaches in southern Israel, and then a large-scale ground assault that involved apparently 2,500 or thereabouts troops, who again were better trained than we've seen in the past and much better armed. Now, my understanding, and a lot of this is coming from now Palestinian sources as filtered through various security entities, the intent was more military style. That is to say, that the intent was to kill as many Israeli soldiers as possible and to steal their equipment. But it morphed into a hostage-taking exercise because hostages can be exchanged in prisoner swaps, and there's a lot of Hamas prisoners in Israel. But it devolved as the hours ran by. It turned into a murderous rampage on the part of at least some of these Hamas fighters. They just let their hatred get the best of them. Their lack of professionalism began to show, and then the massacres occurred. Now, we have to be clear: no matter who does it, crimes against humanity, war crimes are criminal offenses. So once the atrocities started being committed, Hamas is liable for that in any criminal court that can get their hands on them. Let's be very clear. But the main objective of the Hamas assault was what we call the sucker ploy. And the sucker ploy, there's many variations to it in guerrilla warfare, because we're talking now about asymmetric, unconventional, irregular warfare waged by Hamas in the first instance. The idea is you go in and you stage a provocation, an outrageous provocation. Back in my day, there were things like guerrillas would fire tracer rounds out of a village in, let's say, Nicaragua or Vietnam at passing American helicopters or armored columns. The Americans would turn around and they would level the village. The guerrillas would run off into the bush to fight another day. And what we remember is not the initial tracer rounds being shot at the larger military, but the atrocities the larger military committed in response. That's exactly what Hamas wanted out of Israel, and that's exactly what they got. Now, you'd ask yourself, but what, specifically other than that, does Hamas want out of this? Well, I would say there's actually two very clear things. One is to become the undisputed leader of the Palestinian people, marginalizing the Palestinian Authority, which is a toothless wonder and epically corrupt, completely in the pockets of Western entities, and I won't say co-joined at the hip with the Israeli government, but certainly, a lapdog of it. I mean, I'd hate to say it, but the Palestinian Authority is not giving good value to the Palestinian people, be it in the West Bank or being in Gaza. So Hamas, by engaging in this type of armed resistance, which again is legitimate against an occupying force so long as they continue to target military targets. Had they stopped at killing soldiers, I don't think a lot of the world, and me personally, would have had any problem with that.
Just at this point, it might be helpful too if you can perhaps give an indication of the two ways Hamas expresses itself. There's the armed wing that we're seeing here, and you're touching on the political side. Perhaps in recent history, we could see things similar in a way when Sinn Féin in Ireland had its political wing, but there was also obviously the militarized wing. Paul, can you just work our way through that, and then we'll get back to your narrative there?
Right. Well, I mean, they work hand in glove. Now, we have to be very clear. In 2006, Hamas won legitimate democratic legislative elections to represent the Palestinians in the legislature within the Palestinian Authority. They won 74 seats out of 132 or some odd seat parliament. The second placed party, Fatah, only won 45. So overwhelming majority in favor of Hamas. But neither Fatah or any of the other Palestinian groups that were represented in that election, much less the governments of the United States and Israel, were going to allow Hamas to assume authority because they could have formed a government. I mean, it was theirs for the taking. And instead, Fatah launched an ill-fated war on Hamas and was defeated within 6 months. Well, at that point, Hamas didn't have to play nice. By that, I mean democratically. And so it has been the de facto ruler of Gaza ever since then. And it's not a democracy, okay? It's an authoritarian regime, oftentimes quite brutal. So let's make no mistakes that Hamas are a bunch of nice guys. But they were forced into a corner in 2006. I don't know if they could have become like Sinn Féin and the real IRA and what have you, but they were never given a chance in any event. And instead, the Israelis have allowed this puppet Palestinian Authority to exist in the West Bank, even though they have no representation in Gaza. And now Hamas has representation or has a presence in the West Bank. And I'll get to that in a second when we get to second order problems. But the idea was not only to once and for all displace the Palestinian Authority in the eyes of their own people. I mean, this was already happening, right? I mean, Palestinians, better than anyone else, know that the Palestinian Authority are a bunch of corrupt old guys. But this now, I think, is going to push a lot of domestic support within the Palestinian population for Hamas as the undisputed leader. Because in the eyes of the occupied population, they're the guys who are willing to stand up to Israel and not kowtow to them. Again, you and I might say, yeah, but they're sort of, they're tough guys, murderous in many instances. Well, what matters is how the Palestinians view them. But there's another reason why Hamas did this, and we're seeing it play out as we speak. They want to influence the Arab street. That whereas the Sunni oligarchies will do nothing, in fact, the Saudi Arabians were about to sign a bilateral peace treaty with Israel, normalizing relations across the board, where all of these Sunni Arab leaders were willing to accommodate Israel and ignore the plight of the Palestinians. Hamas is saying, you know what? We stand for a free Palestine, and that resonates in the Arab street, not just the Sunni Arab street. You can imagine how Shia feel, about this whole affair, and it's working. Okay, the Sunni Arab world is convulsed right now in favor of the Palestinian cause. Yesterday, there were massive, violent demonstrations in Beirut, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Beirut. It was crazy. Yeah, I said that already. There was another place, but also worldwide. And here's an interesting thing. Maybe Hamas was happy to confine itself to agitating the Arab world, because this makes problems for all these Arab rulers now. Now they have restive populations hitting the streets and fighting with the local law enforcement forces over the Palestinian cause. I mean, this is a galvanizing moment. But let's look at the West. You mentioned Palestinians here in New Zealand. But if you look at London, if you look at various cities in the United States, if you look at France, there have been massive demonstrations in favor of the Palestinian cause. Many of them who say they don't approve of Hamas, but they do believe in the right of Palestinian self-determination. So it's now going into the West. This is a very intelligent ploy, is to, go to the court of world opinion and agitate, because, as I said in the first instance, it makes serious trouble for Arab leaders whether or not they're just full monarchies or semi-constitutional governments. Right now, King Hussein in Jordan has a tremendous problem on his hand because he doesn't want a bar of this, and yet his population, particularly very angry young men, have been storming the border region with Israel, looking to get in and cause some trouble in that border area. The king doesn't need that at all. So I think Hamas understood that tactically it would lose. Its fighters will be eliminated, but that the response from the Israelis, and that's the third instance, would be the classic sucker ploy response. They would respond and collectively punish the Gazan population for the sins committed by Hamas during this attack. And unfortunately, that's exactly what they're doing. And so Israel has played into Hamas's hands, at least in terms of the publicity value. And you know this better than me. I mean, if we look at the coverage of the attacks since the day it happened, a Saturday, and now we're 10 days into this, everything at first in the West that I could see was pro-Israeli. The poor Israelis, they attacked some, tantric rave festival, which incidentally was only 3 miles from the fence and was blaring music that would be heard on the other side of the fence. Talk about insult added to injury, because all that land, by the way, surrounding the fence on the southern Israeli border, surrounding Gaza, used to be Gazan land. That was the original Gazan Strip, which has now shrunk fivefold since 1967. So imagine, you're sitting in this open air prison and you're looking at a bunch of hippies having a rave and not feeling a little, unhappy about that. Just as an aside. Now, the collective meting out of punishment is exactly what Hamas wants, because now they're overcoming, if you will, publicity-wise, their military disadvantage. Now their military disadvantage is working in their favor because they can't defend the Gazan population from the airstrikes. They will not be able to defend the Gazan population from the ground assault that's about to happen. And so you can see it already in the tone of coverage in the West, where some of these mainstream outlets are starting to try to show the Palestinian side, and always with the caveat, we don't support Hamas, but why are we punishing women and children who have nothing to do with this? It's not as if they have a choice.
On that point, there is a very strong awareness that the international rules-based order is in tatters, and that the desire and perhaps the demand coming from via media and even liberal democracies is for the rule of law to be restored. And on the basis of that, humanitarianism needs to be at the forefront of that. An acknowledgement that doesn't matter what colour a person is or what country or what side of the border one comes from, we all bleed. And I think that universal acceptance of what the ideal is has become more acute when we see just how poorly structured the globe is with respect to that very, very important survival principle. So, on those kind of points, I think there's an understanding within, serious media. I'd place among those the coverage that Al Jazera is doing very well, but also from the European side, Deutsche Welle and others, that have massive, huge audiences where they're trying to attempt to perhaps not get caught down that rabbit hole where there is, they did that, so therefore this side did that, because this conflict goes back, obviously, we know, centuries in some ways, and we're seeing the vortex of many, many atrocities that have occurred. We get back to, and you've raised it a number of times, Paul, is the disproportionate methods that are being used by Israel to defend itself in this particular current situation. So I think in many respects you could see that in evidence in the intro that brought to the podcast today, that there was an emphasis on the here and now. So we get back, and I know that may be in some ways an explanation of some countries, some peoples that are within countries that it would be expected would be leaning Israel's way on this, are saying, well, hang on a minute. If we're going to have a two-state solution to this problem in the future, how do we actually get the bedrock of this issue? We'll point out the failings so that we can rebuild if that at all is possible in some way. And then we're not in that space where we can test out the diplomatic elements of whether or not that is worthwhile. Paul, I'll put it back to you, because at this juncture it's probably a good one where you're going to just take it into, let's call it a phase 2, and you'll define what that is. I'm back to you.
Yeah, actually, yeah, no, and actually, by the way, I really enjoyed your summation and your introduction about the rules-based order, this chaos. That'll be when I discuss the third order issues, because I think you're absolutely right. This didn't occur in a vacuum. This occurred where, the global order is in transition. But I'll get to that in due course. What you've just mentioned, the disproportionate response, actually leads easily into what we call the second order issues. And in this instance, it involves Hamas and its allies invoking new fronts, a second front run by Hezbollah out of South Lebanon, but also potential fronts in the Golan Heights and the West Bank itself. If any of these fronts is opened, but certainly if more than one is open, then Israel is going to be increasingly stretched thin on the ground to contain the violence meted out against settlers, Israeli citizens of all sorts. That is why the United States has brought in 2 carrier task forces and a Marine amphibious group in a show of intimidatory power that I think is designed. The United States will have Israelis back, and they will attack Hezbollah. They will attack the Syrians. The Syrians have massed armor and troops on the Golan Heights on their side of the border. I think the Syrians would be nuts to attack Israel, but I'm not inside their heads. We also have to remember, just for the sake of argument, that Hezbollah is Shia Muslim. The Alawite regime run by Assad in Syria is a Shia subsect, and of course Iran are major patrons of all of these groups. And Hamas is distinguished by the fact, although it's a majority Sunni organization, it has Shia fighting columns amongst it. So they're supported by Iran, and Iran in turn is supported by Russia and China. So that axis you were talking about earlier, you can see how it's materializing and how it's now manifesting. Well, the second order problem is if Hezbollah steps in, the U.S. support for Israel militarily may be decisive in curbing their enthusiasm for war. On the other hand, if Hamas takes the fight to the West Bank, which I think is the more realistic possibility, a guerrilla war emerging from within the West Bank, that's a whole other kettle of fish. And then the Syrians are, a throw-in. The Syrians may have to act as proxies of the Russians. See, the Russians are stirring things from behind. This all suits them to a T. In fact, to the point that Putin has offered himself as a mediator in the Hamas-Israel dispute. I mean, I'll say this, not to play on words, but he's got a lot of chutzpah to offer himself to be the mediator. Now, if these multiple fronts open, and it is a very big if, then Israel's got major problems on its hands. It simply does not have the manpower to hold these restive populations at bay for an indefinite period of time. That leads to the third order problem within the region, which is, will this escalate into a major regional war involving Iran, involving Syria? On the one side, Lebanon will become an absolute powder keg if the war crosses into Lebanon, which it certainly will if Hezbollah gets involved. And then what does the Sunni Arab world do if they see this thing starting to mushroom out? And in fact, a lot of the guerrilla movements Hezbollah start making gains within Israel. That invites the big players in. And let's just say no good can come of that. So I think that strategic planners in the West, in the United States in particular, may be saying, if we give them enough support at the second order level, then we'll never need to go to the third order effects. And remember that third order effects it'll be a second order effect. The price of oil is about to spike. All right. Already oil futures are trading higher. They increased $10 overnight after the Hamas attack, and they're still continuing to climb. The fact is this is going to have repercussions way beyond the military field if it's allowed to escalate much further. And like I say, even at the second order level. So I think that I'm not sure how to get people to take a breath and reintroduce humanitarian concerns, because one thing that struck me, and again, we live here, so it's hard to sort of imagine this cycle of hatred, but both sides, both Palestinians and maybe in a lesser way, but in a significant way, Israelis, have been absolutely brutalized by the cycle of violence over the last decades. We can see it in the faces of Palestinian children, every time this happens, but you can also see it in the attitudes of Israelis. The idea that you discuss Palestinians as if they were animals and openly talk about exterminating them. I mean, it's like, wow, this is really, it's so deeply embedded in the psyches of both populations. I personally don't have the skills to break out of that. I just don't know how you deal with what are essentially collective psychoses on both sides. But that has to be done. And you're absolutely right. The trouble here is that there is no consensus on the rules-based order, the so-called liberal international order that used to be. Right now, there is a clear play led by Russia, backed by China, to replace the liberal-based order, the liberal internationalist order, with something else. They say that whatever they have in mind, it's not clear, but that it will serve the interests of the global South better than the liberal international order. And I think there's some merit in that argument. The Palestinians are part of the global South. This resonates. It goes straight to the heart of this conflict, that they are voiceless people, and they are voiceless people in their own region. I mean, did you see that the Jordanian foreign minister said that under no way would Palestinians be offered refuge in Jordan? The Egyptian government
said the same. Yeah.
They said the same.
In the context of escalation, if they were allowed to transit through to Sinai, that would just be, Sinai would become a theatre of war, and the Egyptians weren't going to have that either. So this was part of the justification for keeping the borders closed and containment. We saw that in decades past in the refugee camps, the Palestinian refugee camps located in Lebanon, and the problems that existed in that context. Paul, one of the things, we talked about, perhaps we can apply the word irony, perhaps that Vladimir Putin has been putting himself forward as a mediator. What it stands to me is it illustrates and underscores that this has become a situation of advantage for those that want to push the bipolarity type of thing, and within their own side of that, kind of think in the Cold War kind of context, but only in the context of two defined different sides, that within that building up coalitions of multipolarity, common interests, and that's what you're talking about in those contexts. I think what's coming through. If we stand back from this, because we have all grown up within decades where we saw global powers exercising their wish via conflict in smaller states and smaller regions, particularly post World War II. We've seen a history of that. What's your sense of, and it sounds absolutely cold and calculating, and I don't mean it in that context, but what advantages do you see from both sides as they appear to be squaring off in different contexts to be able to spill other people's blood, but perhaps get around being able to juxtaposition to get an idea of whether or not their opponent is weaker or stronger?
Well, that's exactly it. And you've made a very good point. I started writing about the emerging multipolar world in the aughts, 2006 and 7. I sort of saw, in light of the U.S. Invasion of Iraq, said, this thing is changing. We don't know where we're going, but India's emerging, China's emerged. But you made a very good point. It's not going to be a multipolar order made up of new rising and ascending great powers, like just India, China. We've mentioned Brazil in the past. It's actually going to be constellations. I think you're onto something. We will see the reemergence of a bipolar world order, but it's made of constellations of, on the one hand, maybe decaying liberal democracies, I'd hate to say it, and on the other hand, ascendant authoritarian regimes. Not that the Russians are very ascendant, but China, is a formidable power. We
Within
have
the
to remember
constellation, there's sustainability and perhaps a rebuilding. Yeah.
well,
Of power.
also within that, you can engage in proxy wars. You don't have to engage each other directly. The big powers, they can use their surrogates to test each other's collective will. And we've talked about this, but it bears worth repeating. If you are President Xi in China, or if you are Vladimir Putin in Russia, and you look across at the United States today, I don't know what other people see, but I would see weakness. I would see disarray. I
And I'd
would see
add to that
vanilla.
opportunity from their point of view. And, this gets
Exactly,
back to
exactly.
tearing the international rules-based order into tatters, so that
This,
a rebuild can occur. And I think that's...
you're absolutely right. This is their moment of opportunity. This is what we on the West have to understand. If they don't strike now, they'll never get the chance again if the West ever gets its act together. They've already seen that Western support for Ukraine has started to flag. It started to divide. So they were looking and going, if we just hang in there, eventually, especially in election years, which the United States has one coming, support for Ukraine is going to dissipate, and then we can take them. Right now, given the shift in public opinion around the world away from Israel because of its overreaction, they may be saying, we could parlay this into diplomatic gains. The basic idea is to redraw the geopolitical map of the world in this moment. And here's how, when leaders are preoccupied with the immediate, they lose sight of the long term. And a case in point, Joe Biden. Joe Biden goes and embraces Netanyahu, says the U.S. is 100% behind Israel. And I think, okay, you've got to do that because you're coming into an election year. If you appear to be soft, and that is not completely back Israel, then the Republicans and the Israeli lobby in the states will do everything possible to make sure that you're not reelected. I fully understand his calculus. But on the other hand, he isn't stepping back and saying, but the world sees this in a more nuanced way. The world may say, Hamas is a guerrilla organization that uses terrorist tactics, and that stinks. But Israel is supposedly a liberal democratic state with duly constituted laws and rules and a professional military. And they're engaging in genocidal acts against the Palestinians in Gaza. I mean, I don't think there's, another way to phrase it. And things are shifting worldwide. And I think Biden, he's caught between a rock and a hard place. But I think a lot of democratically world leaders, be it in Germany, be it in France, be it in England, they all too have to calibrate their responses. And it's not going to be unequivocally in favor of Israel anymore. And this is the ultimate evolution of a long-term process where people like me who were raised to think Israel good, the Arabs bad, are now going, it's not as black and white simple as that. Okay, there's blame all over the place. It's a very complex issue with, these historical animosities. We can't just say Israel good, but that's what Biden did. So now the United States, I would hate to say, for their sake, for my American relatives' sake, they've marginalized themselves in the court of world opinion. Sure, they can throw, $1 billion in military aid to Israel. They can show up with a bunch of, great ships.
And that they can express, a number of $1 million worth of humanitarian assistance to Gazans as well, as has been announced. But it does not alter the position that they've taken within this whole mess, that especially when you look at it from a bipolarity point of view. At this juncture, I'll just bring in some of the comments, questions that have largely David Mooring's been raising, once again, some amazingly poignant issues here and placing others into a question. I'll do that. You may wish to address any of these, Paul, and then we'll back to you to raise that last issue that you are wanting to. It's basically like an evaluative type of position on all of this going forward. If that's okay with you, I'll just read these out so their listening audience can hear these too. So bringing up on screen for the benefit of those that are watching and here with us as we record the video live. David Mooring says, Hamas may have enough reasons, but given the scale of the attack by Hamas, was its timing influenced by outside forces of Iran and Russia, or is it more a case of Hamas deciding, if not now, then when? Now, Paul, you in part hit on this earlier on, and it's just a good question just to remind ourselves of what your response was. I'll also just bring up a couple of others while we are here, bringing up on screen for those that are watching as well. If, David Mooring again, if outside influence, given the inevitable result of this conflict, will be ramping up US arms manufacturing and new lower cost drone capability, isn't Russia and Iran shooting themselves in the foot? That's an interesting one. And once again, David brings up, has consideration by either side as to what is going to happen after post-conflict towards a resumption of livable Gaza? So this is an important part as we consider the future. Or is Hamas and Netanyahu just too blinded by anger and strange love logic? I'll leave those there. There's others, but these are the important ones that through the course of the discussion, Paul, have come up from those that have joined us live.
Okay, let me do them in reverse order, as simply as I can. And thanks, Dave, for the as always good questions. There are warmongers on both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That is, there are people who've made their names and staked their positions on perpetuating the endless cycle of violence. This gets to the old political science view that in any regime, you have moderates and militants. And in order to secure democracy or in order to secure peace, the moderates have to prevail over the militants on each side. That's not happening anytime soon. Okay? Netanyahu is not even a militant compared to the religious extremists that he has to the right of him, including his defense minister and minister of war. And then Hamas has seriously hardcore people who, beyond what I mentioned before, saying we want this to hit the Arab street and agitate, the world in favor of the Palestinian cause. They want to spark a religious war. The real militant Hamas guys, this is not nationalistic. This is religious. They want to drive the Jews out. And they have their counterparts in Israel. Okay, again, it's not one-sided. So I don't see this getting solved anytime soon, particularly since, question 2, the military-industrial complexes of several countries will benefit from this war. And drone warfare is just one of them. Everybody's going to, refine their techniques, refine their platforms, first in light of the Ukrainian-Russian war, but now in light of this one. And so, where capitalism obtains and money is to be made off of the anguish of others, interested parties, profit-seeking parties, will enter the fray. And so, unfortunately, that's the situation that I think we're going to be seeing. I don't think that the Russians and Iranians per se will be at a disadvantage as these technologies are refined and then introduced into this and future battlefields. That's the problem. It's encouraging more war because it's now become profitable. Well, it was always profitable, but is now immediately profitable for a number of entities. Remind me, what was the first one? That was actually the.
Yeah, so it's David put it in the first one. Hamas may have enough reasons, but given the scale of the attack by Hamas, was its timing
Oh, yeah.
influenced by outside forces of Iran and Russia, or is it more a case of Hamas deciding if not when, now then when? You touched on this earlier on.
Yeah, no, but it's actually both. Again, David, you're onto it. There is no doubt that there was Iranian training and equipment. Again, if what I've read is correct, they did a lot of their training under the Revolutionary Guard in Iran and or in Syria. A lot of their weapons were supplied by Iran, and those weapons are Russian. Now, there are two things that are interesting here. If you think about the weapons supply chain, it came via overland bridges through Syria into southern Lebanon, where Hezbollah then delivered the weapons to Hamas operatives. There's some question whether or not Hamas had the capability to have these weapons introduced by sea, given that the Israelis have a de facto blockade of Gaza at sea. But certainly there were enough land bridges that they were able to stockpile. Again, this apparently went on for 2 years. And then they received training in small group tactics. Again, the land assault was basically an infantry assault without any armor. And so that appears to have been, a product of Iranian training. So I didn't mention this earlier, but I have no doubts that if a smoking gun is produced that ties Iran to the attack, Israel will attack Iran. And that gets pretty interesting because I am now of the opinion that the Israelis, who apparently have about 200 nuclear weapons, nuclear warheads, especially if this war isn't concluded soon and it starts to metastasize, I wouldn't put it past the Israelis to nuke the Iranians. At least go for their nuclear sites, anything that could hurt Israel. Not Tehran per se. Militarily, it wouldn't be advisable to do that, but that's where we could be headed. So Iran's definitely in. Now, there are reports that the week before the attack, Iranian Revolutionary Guard leaders met with Hamas leaders under the aegis of Hezbollah in Beirut. That's being disputed, but less disputed are reports that say that Hamas leaders were in Moscow 2 weeks before the attack. If either of these reports are true, and again, the speculation is still out there, it's still open, But that means that Hamas was given a green light by the Russians and the Iranians to go and do this. That's not good. Okay. One has to sort of hope that this was Hamas on its own celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, because it fell on the exact day, the start of that war. And, I don't want to overdo the symbolism, because in a weird way, the symbolism is not substantive. In the Yom Kippur War, Israel was attacked by all of its Arab neighbors, which are duly constituted states. In this war, a armed resistance group is attacking the occupying state, which happens to be Israel. So the irony of tying the Yom Kippur War to this one was certainly not lost on me. And again, it stretches the symbolism, if you will. But the key here is Israel will not, it's very clear, they will not rest on eliminating the Hamas leadership. They may have to take their time, but they are going to exact revenge on patrons and sponsors who may have encouraged this attack, and certainly if they equipped and trained Hamas fighters on their own land. Israel will respond. That's the way it goes about its business. And one can assume that in light of that, particularly the Iranians may be thinking about contingency plannings as we speak. That then invokes the Sunni Arab world. If Iran starts attacking Israel, even if it says it's for defensive reasons, then you've got the possibility of a shift in the balance of power within the Middle East along its current axes towards something else that may be more Iran favored, unless Israel takes Iran out completely, which I don't think they'll do. And so again, the possibility of escalation through the second order into the third order into a major regional war, which then invites the United States, Russia. I think the PRC is going to sit this one out. See, they're in the best position. They can surreptitiously supply Iran and let Iran do the dirty work, and they can sort of sit back. The Russians are too engaged in Syria. We've talked about this in the past. There are 100,000 Russian citizens live in Syria as a result of intermarriage between Syrians and Russians under the previous Assad regime. Remember, they were backed by the Soviets back in the day, continued to be armed and trained by Russian troops. There are Russian troops on the ground in Syria.
And the original Assad regime was indebted significantly financially to Russian enterprise.
Yeah, and the Alawite intelligentsia, Assad's smart people, are heavily intermarried with Russians. And so that's why the Russians are there. That's why the whole Syrian conflict was misread by Barack Obama. He didn't realize how vested the Russians are in Syria, dating back to the 1960s. And they got a lot of boots on the ground. And so if the Syrians make a move in the Golan Heights, who's to say there aren't Russian advisors, in the general vicinity? And so, things can really start to move sideways in very wrong ways. And so I think that Hamas may have done the timing to concur with the anniversary date, but there clearly was at least Iranian involvement in the planning and preparation. And then perhaps the Russians were sort of second order sponsors, but didn't want to get their fingers wet, knowing what would probably come. That would be my reckoning.
Let's begin to wrap this up, and I'll begin with a couple of the comments that have come in. Cliff here, welcome, Cliff. He says here's a scenario: Israel will usher in Fatah PA security forces to take over North Gaza. In part, you spoke to this particular issue before, and you will have a view, I know, Paul, on that. And once again, David Mooring, and this is a quotation that he's got here, expecting violence to provide a solution to intractable polarized situations is like watching two rabid dogs fighting each other. The only choice is which dog to shoot first. Neither can survive. What that does, I think, Paul, is it brings us to perhaps a wrap up that looks at, while we've acknowledged that the international rules-based order is in tatters, and while we've acknowledged, and I think it's an accurate one, that the United Nations as an institution is toothless at this time on these major global issues for many, many reasons, of which we have already addressed in previous episodes as well. What out of all of this mess could come from this, from the point of view of some sort of, and you conditioned this question to a degree by an emphasis or a scope on what was perhaps starting to emerge from the authoritarian polarized base that the world is seeing expand on at the moment. But are we going to have perhaps out of this in the future a United Nations type, a reformed United Nations, where issues relating to veto inadequacies at the Security Council, perhaps more empowering on the General Assembly by way of operating within a numbers-based thing as opposed to developing consensus blocks? Do you see those types of things in the future as being able to tame down a world where it approaches hostilities toward each other from two distinctly diverse sides, as we have done in the latter part of the 20th century?
Well, I think that, well, to begin with, there's a certain irony in that if the current conflict is shifts to diplomatic negotiations and humanitarian corridors can be opened and what have you, the irony is that it will change nothing. The status quo will go back to being what it was, and we'll have another conflict down the road. Again, the last big one between Hamas and Israel was in 2019. So there are regular intervals. So in a weird way, we have to let this run its course to a certain extent, I would say, into the second order or third order, in order for the global community to realize how dangerous this is and how the new polarity that you so well described is actually not a solution, because then we get these constellations of counterposed blocks who will use proxies to wage war on each other, will see conflicts like this in opportunistic terms. And so if that happens, that is, this runs its course, hopefully not into nuclear war, then I think it's the community of medium and small nations, my preference being for liberal democratic nations, but that smaller countries realize what New Zealand's been saying all along, not that they always adhere to that, which is the smaller you are, the more you want a rules-based order. You're protected by rules and norms, not by military might. And that's a better protection than military alliances, which can often be fickle. I mean, if I was the Taiwanese, wouldn't trust the U.S. security guarantee. I think, yeah, the Yanks talk a good game,
Nor
but
feel comfortable with informed commitment that alliances actually insist on.
yeah. I mean, again, some alliances are durable and they work the charm for smaller countries to get under the umbrella of their bigger partners, but not all of them are. And you made the point months ago that if you just step back a little bit and you look at the United States, it's increasingly look like an unstable political system that sort of waxes and wanes about who it's going to support and who it wasn't. Well, I thought that point was very well taken. I personally would not put 100% trust in what the United States or any other big power for that matter tells us when it comes to security guarantees. So I think that again, the ironies are multiple, But you're going to need this thing to deepen in order for people to sort of waken up from their slumber and realize we can't go on like this. And it's not just about the principles. It's not just about Israel and Hamas or Israel and Palestine. It's actually the broader community now is going to feel those spillover effects, and those effects will be all negative. I mentioned oil prices, I mean, even in indirect ways. And so perhaps as this deepens, more countries, including New Zealand, will come in and say, we are going to form a multinational coalition for peace, in which we are going to try to broker some form of agreement with the assumption that the bigger powers at play will accept whatever is negotiated. Then you got to sell it to the principles. And whether the Israelis on the one hand or Hamas on the other hand accept what is negotiated by the broader community, seems improbable. But again, we've reached the point where we need to start considering improbable solutions to what is an intractable problem. And so I think that's it. It opens a window of opportunity for small and medium countries to try to get involved in order to prevent this from escalating into major regional war or even tactical nuclear war with regards to Iran and Israel. But it'll take a little while more of these atrocities for people to fully realize the depth of the consequences should we just stand around and tut and take sides.
Thank you, Paul. So we'll call the program to a conclusion now. Thank you to those who have joined us for the live recording of A View from Afar after a bit of a spell, and while the situation that brought us back to the cameras here to bring you an episode is certainly a grave one. It's hopefully one that is meaningful and perhaps evaluative and information providing for many. So, as is appropriate in many forums, one would like to say, stay safe out there. Let peace be in your house in whatever tongue that you express that sentiment. And we'll look forward to coming back to you all again in the future very soon with something that is perhaps as deep and revealing and perhaps analytically based and helpful as we determine to make understanding out of what is such a complex world. Bit of a rave from me at the end of the program. Have a good one out there. Ka kite anō, as we say in New Zealand, and take care. Goodbye.